When someone breaks a promise, the consequences can be devastating, especially if you think about it in the court of law. We've all heard stories about people who lied under oath, and then someone who's innocent ends up going to prison because of it. That's a good little background for lesson 4 in today's series on the Jesus way. We're going to talk today about keeping your word, because this is what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5. He said, "You've heard that our ancestors were told, you must not break your vows. You must carry out the vows that you make to the Lord." But Jesus says this, "I say, don't even make any vows." He says, don't say by heaven, because heaven is God's throne, and don't say by the earth, because the earth is his footstool, and don't say by Jerusalem, for Jerusalem is the city of the great king. Don't even say by my head, for you can't turn one hair black or white. Now, I'll explain all of that in just a second, but here's the bottom line. Jesus says, just say a simple yes, I will, or no, I won't. Anything beyond this is from the evil one. Let's break this passage down and apply it to today's world. See, the Pharisees made a game out of vows back in Jesus' day, and they created a loophole that undermined God's original intent all along. Let me show you what I mean by putting some passages side by side. Jesus was pointing out here that the Pharisees had all these little rules about whether a vow was worthy of keeping or not, or another way to say that is whether a vow could be broken or not. So when he says by heaven and by earth and by Jerusalem and by my head, he's talking about how the Pharisees would mince their words and have all these little exceptions so that you could get out of telling the truth. It helps to put Matthew 23 next to it. He says to the Pharisees, you say that it means nothing to swear by God's temple, but that it is binding to swear by the gold in the temple. And so then he calls them blind fools. He says, you say that to swear by the altar is not binding, but to swear by the gifts on the altar is binding. Once again, Jesus says, how blind. Maybe a good equivalent for today would be to say that I had my fingers crossed behind my back, so it doesn't count. The promise doesn't really matter. These are the kinds of games that the Pharisees played, and it created this loophole that undermined God's original intent, which was all about keeping your word. See, Jesus is not forbidding oaths in this passage. He's telling us not to play games with the truth. Now, throughout history, there have been some groups of Christians that would read this passage from Matthew 5, and therefore they think that you shouldn't take an oath under law, that you should never swear to God or anything like that. But I think if you view it this way, you're missing the point. I mean, do your research for yourself. It's pretty clear that vows are not unbiblical. Here are 3 quick reasons why. First of all, Paul himself swore to God. You can look it up for yourself. Not only that, but Jesus didn't object to it when he was standing trial right before the crucifixion. And last but not least, God swore by his name in many places, but a couple of them are Genesis 22 and Psalm 110. So clearly, taking a vow is not unbiblical. Jesus is getting at something more fundamental here. And Numbers chapter 23 helps us to understand it. It says there that God is not a man, so he does not lie. He is not human, so he does not change his mind. Has he ever spoken and failed to act? Has he ever promised and not carried it through? These, of course, are rhetorical questions, and the point is that God is the ultimate oath keeper, and Jesus is saying that if we're a Christian, that we should also keep our word, just like God. In fact, the brother of Jesus, his name was James, and he has a book of the Bible named after him, in chapter 5, verse 12, says this, most of all, my brothers and sisters, never take an oath by heaven or earth or anything else. So it's a little summary of what Jesus says in Matthew 5. But he also finishes this little section just like Jesus finished his antithesis. Just say a simple yes or no so that you will not sin and be condemned. So this whole section of scripture is just simply about keeping your word as a Christian. Expositor's Bible Commentary says that by differentiating between what was binding and what was not, wittingly or unwittingly, the Pharisees encouraged evasive oaths and therefore lying. But Jesus cuts through these complexities by insisting that people must tell the truth. He charges the teachers of the law and the Pharisees with mishandling the scriptures that they claimed to defend. And that leaves us with just one more important thing to cover. See, as Christians, when our words can't be trusted, then it's hard to point people to a God who can be. We're supposed to be mirrors of a God who never changes his mind, who never minces his words, who always speaks the truth. So if you are known as someone who tells some white lies, or you don't keep your word, you don't allow your yes to be yes, or your no to be no. In other words, if you play games with the truth, then you're not representing God to the world that's watching. And those are the worst consequences of not keeping your word. That's even worse than not keeping your word in the court of law. Hebrews chapter 6 says this, God also bound himself with an oath, so that those who received the promise could be perfectly sure that he would never change his mind. Therefore, we who have fled to him for refuge can have great confidence as we hold to the hope that lies before us. This hope is a strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls. This is the God that we're pointing people to as Christians. So let's make a commitment 24/7 to not play games with the truth and to be people who keep our word.